The gunsmith revolutionized Call of Duty as a whole, but also plays a major role in Warzone. As Warzone has progressed, the gunsmith has gotten more convoluted and overwhelming, but we still seem to be using the same 5 attachments on almost every gun. I'm Ornery, and today we are taking a look at the entire history of meta attachments in Warzone. You know the ones I'm talking about, the attachments that you don't even have to think twice about when you equip it in the gunsmith. But go ahead and comment an attachment you can't live without as we get started. To kick things off, we have the Monolithic Suppressor, which was available on just about any gun that supported a muzzle attachment. The big plus going on here is not appearing on the mini-map, which in Warzone is pretty important. But on top of that, it also boosted your damage range. Aside from that, the only drawback it had was a slight hit to your ADS speed and your aim walking steadiness, but since this was primarily used for long-range guns, that didn't really matter too much at all. On top of being used primarily for ARs and LMGs, this was the meta attachment for most snipers as well. The Kar 98, HDR, and AX50 most notably. Beefing up that damage range, you had brutal body shots that could 2-tap. The easiest way to summarize the Monolithic Suppressor was if you wanted to have any type of suppressor, this is the one you would use, and it wasn't even close. There is an argument against very close range builds such as SMG since your ADS speed kinda mattered, but if you were using any MW19 gun, the muzzle spot was always used up with the Monolithic Suppressor. We have a Monolithic Suppressor in Warzone today, but it's not near as good or even relevant at all compared to the Modern Warfare 19 Monolithic. Sniping at the launch of Warzone was very different than it is today for several reasons. To kick things off, we had the thermal meta that had long-range sniping at all-time simplest form. Basic thermal sniper scope not only had a nice reticle that stood out, but this was a time where thermal scopes functioned completely differently than what they do today. They were completely overpowered and pretty much would show anyone no matter how far away they were as long as they weren't using cold-blooded. This meant you would see players that you normally would never be able to see, thus creating the thermal sniper meta that was pretty much the only way you could snipe for the longest time. The basic thermal optic was the best, but this effect carried over to any optic that was thermal, meaning that you could use the 3x or variable zoom and still have this effect. As far as mid to close range guns, well, there really was no space for them since the real advantage here was the long distance spotting. In a state where snipers were nearly hit scan, it wasn't uncommon to wipe teams across the map since you were able to see them. Just a few months after launch, all thermal optics would get hit with the nerf in their view distance that would render them useless for the rest of Warzone. There has been no reason to use a thermal optic since. Shotguns always find a way to make their way into the meta, but there's one attachment that's abundant throughout all of them, and that is the Dragon's Breath ammo. This gives a residual fire effect that deals damage after the shot lands, making for some of the most annoying encounters in the game. Anyways, pretty much any shotgun that supports this attachment and is decent had found its way into the meta. The R9, the Broadside, and the Haymaker come to mind. It will always find a way. Anyways, the trade-off here was that you didn't have near as much range, but that didn't really matter because it's a close-range shotgun. Dragon's Breath residual damage just made up for it. There have been a few other methods of shotguns such as the dual trigger, but most people will agree that the Dragon's Breath will reign supreme. Raven always claimed to fix the Dragon's Breath ammo, but that never seems to be the case in every iteration of Warzone. For the most part, what optic you use comes down to preference and whatever works for you. However, the VLK 3.0 was the meta optic for these mid-range engagements with assault rifles and LMGs. For starters, the 3x zoom is the perfect zoom level for these mid-range engagements. It also is a scope that just had no clutter going on. Very simple and to the point, just the crosshairs and absolutely nothing else. On top of this, in Warzone 1, you could customize your reticles that added some more flair to the optic choosing process. But shortly after the Cold War integration, people were desperate to find any optic similar to the VLK, and we ended up getting the Axle Arms optic, which was another 3.0 optic. Pretty similar to the VLK, but just the Cold War version. Just figured I would mention it here so we don't have to talk about it again. On to Warzone 2, where we have the worst gunplay in all of Call of Duty. This meant that anything to get your gun to shoot as straight as possible was necessary. Enter the high velocity ammo. This ammo type made your bullets shoot at near hit scan velocity. The only expense was your damage range, which wasn't much to be concerned with since you were going to be hitting way more shots in return. This was great for mid to long range ARs and LMGs, but where it really shined was the snipers. The little opportunity you had with snipers in Warzone 2 needed to be maxed out. That was with the high velocity ammo, since snipers didn't one-shot, the hit you took to your damage range was completely irrelevant. So once again, just making your sniper a laser beam was your top priority. With the small sniper meta going on, every sniper would get the high velocity treatment and usually resulted in a 2-shot. Since it was easy to use, it wasn't uncommon to land a body or headshot, then have an easy follow-up shot, which I think is due in part to the high velocity ammo. Now onto the meta optic for Warzone 2, and that was the Aim Op V. To be honest, I couldn't tell you why this was the optic to use, but I think it somewhat reduced the visual recoil of the gun. And once again, in a game that has tons of visual recoil, anything helps. Basically, it was an enhanced red dot sight that kept visibility and seemed to help hit your shots. I really don't know the science behind it, but I know that I was definitely running this optic back in Warzone 2 just because everyone else said to. There really was no other choice. Recoil control is a big deal with guns in Warzone, and there are a lot of conflicting choices when it comes to the best one. Specifically, the horizontal recoil is much harder to control than the vertical recoil, and the Bruin Heavy support did a great job at countering that. While most attachments don't directly target horizontal recoil, the Bruin did, and did it in a great way. Quickly became the go-to attachment for most ARs and LMGs, and still is when it comes to recoil control. You can even run this on sniper support SMGs if you really wanted to. So far on this list, we've kind of stayed away from the meta SMG attachments, and that's due in part because it almost feels like every SMG had its own build that was different from the other ones. Well, in Warzone 3, the DR6 handstop and the XRK Edge has become the meta underbarrel attachment for every SMG. Basically acting as an ADS speed increase and nothing else, it makes a world of difference in those close range encounters where every second counts. This is pretty much your go-to underbarrel for just about every SMG build, and it really comes down to which one feels better for you. With Warzone 3, once in a now again, we get new attachments that work on just about every gun. The first that really broke into the meta was the JAK BFB muzzle. This significantly reduced your recoil on all fronts at the expense of your damage range, ADS speed, and a new effect which is a longer appearance on your radar, but not only that, you will also show up the same way on an advanced UAV does. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, you would know that I think the advanced UAV, bird's eye, comms vest, or whatever is somewhat useless. Since Warzone has so many buildings and verticality, you're going to want to know exactly which level the enemy is on when they're shooting. And since that doesn't display with the advanced UAV effect, one could argue that this is actually a plus to the JAK BFB instead of a drawback. Outside of the radar effect, the recoil reduction had to be one of the most drastic that we've ever seen. I mean, it was almost 40% in each regard across the board, which is just not even close to anything else. This made just about any gun shoot straight, which no other attachment is capable of. Anyways, about a month or two later, it would get a pretty dramatic nerf that made it not near as powerful, but still a great option if you're looking for a maximum recoil reduction build. Shortly after the JAK BFB dropped, we got the Z35 compensated flash hider. This also took the muzzle slot, and similarly to the DR6 handstop and XRK Edge, was your go-to for all SMGs. Buffing your aim stability, both horizontal and vertical recoil, this made your gun much easier to use. But on top of this, you also got an added effect of shortened radar pings. This means you'll show up on the radar as if you're shooting an unsuppressed weapon, but just for a much shorter duration. It quickly became the closest thing to a suppressor without being a suppressor, while still giving you a ton of added bonuses. You did take a slight hit to your bullet velocity, but since this was primarily used on SMGs, that really didn't matter whatsoever. Since this dropped nearly alongside the JAK BFB, to sum things up, the Z35 was your go-to muzzle for your SMG, and the JAK BFB was your go-to muzzle for your long-range AR or LMG. Onto the first meta optics for Warzone 3, being the JAK glassless optic. There was nothing special about the reticle itself. In fact, it wasn't really all that different than any other red dot, but this had an added effect of reducing your visual recoil significantly. Also carrying the same cons as any other optic, there really isn't any reason to not be using this optic for mid to short range, since any reduction to visual recoil with no extra cons is just a no-brainer. I'll go ahead and give the Corio Eagle Eye 2.5x optic a shout, which is good for all the same reasons that the VLK that we already mentioned, but I'll venture to say the glasses optic is much more used in the Corio. That lack of visual recoil just hits so hard and is still very much so in the meta today. Where the hell was this thing for Warzone 2? Quartermaster Suppressor is now the muzzle of choice for just about any build. Before we talk about that, we can give the VT7 Spiritfire Suppressor a shout here as well. This was actually one of the best suppressors in all of Warzone. This gave you a buff in recoil control, bullet velocity, and damage range while keeping you off the radar. The only con was that it kind of nuked your ADS speed and sprint-to-fire speed, so you really only should be using this on an LMG. Regardless, it was kind of giving Monolithic Suppressor vibes. Anyways, onto the Quartermaster Suppressor, which is basically a suppressed JAK BFB muzzle. So yeah, everything I said about the JAK BFB can pretty much be said about the Quartermaster, only the Quartermaster is suppressed, so I'd definitely go with the Quartermaster. As of right now, this is your go-to for all builds, including SMGs. However, if you want to focus more so on long-range encounters, the Spiritfire may be more your thing. To round this list off, we have the Paracord Grip, which is the jack of all trades when it comes to underbarrels. Buffing your sprint to fire, horizontal recoil, idle sway, and steadiness, this is your undeniable go-to for all SMG builds. The beauty of it all is that it has absolutely zero negative effects whatsoever, which is very rare. Usually an underbarrel leans more towards recoil or sprint to fire, but never both. But the Paracord hits both without any con, which makes it the safest option. Very recently, we also got the jack slash underbarrel, which is another somewhat meta contending underbarrel. Basically, the only time you'd use this if you want a total movement build and nothing else, so pretty much just an honorable mention is what I'll give it. But the Paracord Grip is so good that I would not be surprised if they nerf it like the jack BFB. That's the entire history of meta attachments in Warzone. Let me know if I missed any. Also comment your all-time favorite attachment. If you want to hear the entire history of pay to win, pay to lose, forgotten attachments, or snipers, go ahead and click on screen here. Join my Discord if you're feeling crazy. Help change this statistic. And if you liked, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. And thank you so much for watching.